We care that Pakistan people have good water, but the country, an enigma. What's its relations to us in Afghanistan? Today's Times editorial page comment by the director of the Jackson School says, the recent tragic events left it in a turmoil. So where is it headed? An enigma, like the Middle East. Do we understand that? I'm sure there's as many articles and comments about it as we can find. Fortunately, we have former Ambassador to Pakistan here to enlighten and answer. So think about your questions. Appointed in 2001, she was the first female ambassador to that Muslim nation. One of our largest embassies. A month later, 9/11 happened. The United States needed Pakistan as its ally. Having created excellent relationships with President Musharraf and its people, Ambassador Chamberlin successfully negotiated it, earning her a reputation as a talented peacekeeper and a crisis manager. Ambassador Chamberlin didn't start out to be a 30-year diplomat. She began as a teacher with degrees from Northwestern and Boston University. When she returned from teaching history in Laos, all the teaching jobs had dried up. So she launched a new career path with the Foreign Service. For about a year now, she's been president of the Middle East Institute. This Washington, D.C. organization is a conduit for information between Middle Eastern nations and Americans. To help us better understand the Middle East and Pakistan, please welcome Ambassador Wendy Chamerlin.
Well, thank you very much. I've got a lot of competition here with beautiful music and entertaining skits and brilliantly done introductions. So I really do look forward to talking to you. I actually look forward more after my remarks to your questions, because I always think that with an audience as distinguished as this, that's where you really get into the more interesting part of the program. You know, we have been all exposed almost too much over the last many months to our own presidential elections. But there is a certain theme that is emerging very clearly, and that is that all of the candidates are talking about change. Comes up in almost every other sentence by our candidates. And I think implicit in the pledge of all of our candidates for change is the understanding that something's broken. Something's broken that needs to be fixed, and we need to have change. And I think that's true, and I don't think anybody would deny that our relations with the Middle East are very strained at this time and have been for several years. But if we're going to change, and if we're going to fix a damaged dialogue, we need to know what it is that's broken. We need to know more about how the people in the Middle East and the Muslim world think about us. We can't simply dwell on what we think about them. So I'd like to spend a few moments this afternoon talking about what it is, how the people of the Middle East perceive the United States. To Muslims throughout the Middle East, the war on terror sounds more like a declaration on Islam. Whether we like this or not, whether it's true or not, that's how they perceive it. You are either with us or against us gives them the distinct impression that anybody who opposes U.S. policy is necessarily a terrorist. This perceived bias, combined with a history of missteps in action and double standards by the U.S., as they perceive it, has severely damaged our relations with the people in the region. In an extensive Gallup poll published this year, Muslims around the world said that the U.S. could improve relations in the Middle East by moderating our views towards Islam and by voicing respect for their religion. But it's not as easy as it sounds. It sounds easy, but it's not. In fact, our public views are hardening over the years. Another poll, a Pew research study, revealed that the percentage of Americans who believe Islam is more likely than other religions to encourage violence has actually increased. It used to be 25% in 2002. Today it's 45% of Americans. But still I'm an optimist. And I believe we can and will restore our credibility and trust between the people of the Middle East. And I think we can do this by gaining a better understanding that there is more that unites us than divides us. The vast majority of the world's Muslims are mainstream and they're nonviolent. Like most Americans, they're overwhelmingly family-oriented, religious people who practice their faith while coping with the modern world, just like us. More than half the population of the Middle East are under 25, not like us. But they want a better education, they want jobs, they want houses, they can't get married unless they can have a house. They have aspirations that are very real to them. For millions of Muslims, Islam is a religion of peace. They condemn the violent practices. Vast majority condemns the violent practices of al-Qaeda, and they're outraged at the notion that their mosques are used to promote violence. When we talk about what we have in common, it's perhaps most interesting to note that according to a poll done in 2007 by the Gallup, political freedom and freedom of speech are what the Muslims most admire about us. The same answers we give about ourselves. There are other American values that the Muslims also admire, including our education system and our entrepreneurship. They've flocked for years to our universities to learn the American way of doing business, and they're doing it very well. If any of you have had an opportunity to visit Dubai, the UAE, Doha, you'll be astonished at how American capitalism is thriving in these now centers of finance in the Gulf. But of course, we can't treat the world's Muslims as a monolith, just as no one would want to treat Americans as a single personality. Of the more than 1 billion Muslims worldwide, only a minority are Arab, only about 340 million. The most populous Muslim country in the world isn't even in the Middle East. It's in Asia, Southeast Asia. It's Indonesia. There are more Muslims in Hindu India, 150 million, than in the 5 Arab states of North Africa and Saudi Arabia. Yet despite the cordial relations that we do have with the governments of the region, with our government, the people of the region hold a startlingly low opinion of us. A Pew Research Center survey last summer showed that 3 out of 4 Turks, Jordanians, and Egyptians had an unfavorable view of the United States, and so did 1 out of every 2 Lebanese, Kuwaitis, and Moroccans. So how can we explain this contradiction? If they admire American values so much, they did, after all, and I'd like to point out, Muslims throughout the world stood shoulder to shoulder with us in the first few days after the attack in New York and Pennsylvania and Washington on 9/11. And I was ambassador then, and I'd like to attest to the heartfelt outpouring of genuine grief and sympathy from the Pakistani people, certainly, but also the people throughout the region when we were attacked. The majority of Muslims there were thunderstruck by the cruelty of the terrorist act and saw it as an attack on humanity itself. Many of them would come to me and say, Ambassador Chamberlain, you know, it's called the World Trade Center, and the attack was on the world. But sadly, many of them felt that their expressions of solidarity were very quickly rebuffed by America and Americans. Muslims who had admired the United States, studied in our university, and done business in our companies suddenly encountered racial profiling and collective punishment. Getting a student visa was nearly impossible. Businessmen decided to invest elsewhere when they couldn't get visas, and rather than suffer some of the humiliation as they tried to enter through our U.S. customs. An example, in February of 2006, the Dubai Ports World, company wishing to invest in the United States, encountered just this kind of a situation. And rather than going through the political maelstrom that it found itself in, the company decided to invest elsewhere. Too many companies decided to invest elsewhere. And this is unfortunate. For example, the UAE, home of the Dubai Ports World, was the first Middle Eastern state to permanently locate U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers in the UAE ports to inspect its containers before shipment to the U.S. And they've been a key ally in the fight against Saddam Hussein. The UAE has entertained more port visits by U.S. naval vessels than any other nation. The U.S. not only lost a significant foreign investment opportunity, but rather ran a very serious risk of offending a long-term ally. One story, let me tell you a story that is widely circulating within the diplomatic corps in Washington, particularly the Arab embassies. It's a story of our American security police that stormed an airplane. One of the passengers, the names of one of the passengers had popped up on our terrorist list. And they stormed the plane, dressed with weapons, dressed as ninjas, looking for the terrorist that was trying to sneak into the United States. Well, they found Mohammed, a 6-year-old, at that point convulsing in tears. This story goes around. There's another story I hadn't planned to tell, but I might as well, as the price of gasoline is tipping some of the highest rates that it's ever been. Many of our analysts believe that the price of gasoline is so high because there is the choke point are our refineries. Well, a couple of years ago, the CEO of Saudi refinery company wanted to make the largest investment ever in a refinery in Port Arthur, Texas. A foreign investment in Texas that would have been very important and provided some of the refinery needs that we did. This CEO is a Saudi, but he studied in California. He married an American. His children were American. He had many American visas in his passport. Yet it took him 10 months to finally get a visa to come and begin to negotiate this deal in Houston. And only then, after the intervention of Saudi Aramco, when he did fly in to the airport in Houston in his private jet, he was detained for 10 hours and rather harshly and rudely interrogated. That deal was delayed for a couple of years, not surprisingly. Tensions run much deeper than resentment of perceived irrationality after 9/11. The developing anger against the United States by many in the Middle East is not because they hate our freedom, but rather because in the eyes of many people out there, our rhetoric on democracy, on liberty, on fairness and justice hasn't been matched by our recent actions. The complaints of double standards, they see it as double standards, and they find it too commonplace. The people of the region have welcomed U.S. calls for democracy, but they've scrutinized the way our reactions to their elections when they have them. We championed elections, but when Hamas, who we don't favor, won in a free and fair election, we repudiated it. We championed democracy in Pakistan, but we call President Musharraf as indispensable at the very time he's dispensing of free and fair elections, when he's dispensing of the Constitution and protections of citizens, and when he's dispensing of the rule of law by disbanding the Supreme Court, and when he's dispensing of free speech by arresting many journalists. Another important step to take along the road to repairing relations is to develop a better understanding of the psychology of the few, the minority, that practice terrorism against us. Many of these people, and I'm certainly not apologizing for them because there is frankly nothing more important to the security of the people in the region and us and the world than to eliminate terrorism. But you need to understand who they are and what they're thinking. There's a recent book by a former CIA case officer, Mark Sageman, that I encourage you to read. He's done a lot of study on the psychology of the militant jihadists. And he finds that, and this was a surprise to me, that they're not marginalized or misfits, that he finds that they're, quote, part of a violent, born-again social movement. He likens them to the Russian anarchists of the late 19th century that are motivated by idealism. It came to me as a surprise, but Sageman describes these terrorists as being generally educated, idealistic young people who seek glory by fighting for fairness and justice, or at least fairness and justice as they see it, not certainly as I or you would see it. So you can see we do have different assumptions about who we're confronting. And to be effective in our counterterrorism strategy, we've got to have a better idea, a more accurate understanding of their composition, of their motivations, and their beliefs, the beliefs of our adversary. Another Middle East pollster, Shibli Tahami, working out of the University of Maryland, has recently conducted a poll, cross-section poll, widely throughout the Middle East region, asking the question, what aspect of al-Qaeda appealed to them? We need to know this. 33% said none, nothing. Nothing about the al-Qaeda was appealing. An equal number said they were attracted to al-Qaeda because they confronted the United States. 14% said that al-Qaeda appealed to them because they championed Muslim causes like the Palestinians. Only 11% supported al-Qaeda methods, meaning terrorism, and still fewer, 7%, supported al-Qaeda because it supported the creation of an Islamic State. I think we may have flipped that had we conducted that same poll among American citizens. But I think we ought to face reality, and the reality is that we're never going to be able to eliminate terrorism altogether. We've always in our history faced some kind of terrorism, whether it was Cubans hijacking airplanes, as we saw it in our youth. Terrorist acts will happen, but they will not threaten the existence of our great state or our great values. It's something we must deal with, but it's not existential. Terrorism is not an ideology that threatens us. It's simply a tactic. It's a tactic used by the desperate and the weak. And the measure of our success as Americans is will not be when every last al-Qaeda is killed, but rather when what we stand for in the United States, when our values and our principles and our ideology is more attractive than violence and fear, when our actions begin to match our words. So, in conclusion, what advice would we give the next President of the United States as they promise, all of them, to repair and repair the fractured friendships in the Middle East? Well, first, we'd say don't wait for a terrorist attack to address the genuine grievances of the youth in the Middle East, more than half the population. We must not only talk about democracy, but we must support it. Support it with good governance, with economic opportunity, with political participation. The kind of projects that this Rotary Club is doing with the water projects in northern Pakistan, that's exactly what we ought to be doing. And that is how we repair our dialogue with the people. It is a demonstration of our values, and it goes directly to the people. So I couldn't be more enthusiastic about the work of this Rotary Club. The U.S. needs to champion the rights of the people, all people, rather than appear to be pursuing our own national interests. And the second point I'd tell the President is that its equally pressing priority is to restore our credibility as an honest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. By this time, a lot of work has been done over the decades, and anybody who's been following it knows that the outlines of a deal is there. It's in reach. But what we badly need now is the political will to hammer it out, not just on the United States, but among the Palestinians and the Israelis as well. For the region, this is the key to diminishing the appeal of many of these radical militant jihadists. The alternative will only be more violence and more terror. The critical test for the next president, regardless of which party, is to construct a new relationship in the Middle East based upon ongoing accurate assessment of the status of our relationship. Rebuilding trust will depend much less on how we feel about them and more on how they view the impact of our policies on their own society. And finally, this is not the time to close our doors, to close our ports, and to close our minds to the rest of the world. But it's a time to move beyond the rhetoric of terror and fear. Our security is linked to the security of our friends and our allies in the Middle East and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Their stability ultimately depends on pursuing the democratic system and institutions that give their citizens a voice in determining their future. Next week, February 18th in Pakistan, there will be an important election. And much will ride in Pakistan as it's truly facing a crossroads as a country. Will the people perceive the election is rigged and distorted and go to the streets in violence? And will that violence tend to encourage the militant jihadism that is a threat to Pakistan? Or will that election be accepted by the people as an expression of their true voice, and will they come together as a nation, as the true majority of the Pakistanis want, to build a society based in the spirit of their founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which is one based on constitutional democracy and the rule of law. It's an important event, and we'll all be watching it. I hope you'll ask me questions about Pakistan. Thank you.
We hurried things up, we got it going, and Wendy kindly said that she would take lots of questions and answers, so we have lots of time to do it.
I'm Burr Stewart. We've heard a lot about the role of women in the Middle East and in Pakistan. Could you comment on the differences between the role of women in that culture and in this culture, and how that affects our policies?
Well, yes, thank you very much, and thank you for putting the question that way. I usually get a question, and I can almost count on it. How could a woman serve as an ambassador in a country like Pakistan or in the Middle East? That's a much more sophisticated question that you asked, and it has a very different answer. The answer to the question you did not ask is, as a female ambassador, you represent your country. I represented the United States of America, and I was treated with the respect of my country, and I was always treated very well, honorary man, I guess you could say. have never found throughout my diplomatic career as a woman serving in Malaysia, in Kinshasa, the Congo with Lou McFarlane, my good friend, serving in Morocco and elsewhere. I have never found it a disadvantage, my gender to be a disadvantage. In fact, many times it was an advantage. I'll be quite frank with you. Musharraf is a very charming man, and he likes talking to women. But women in Pakistan and women throughout the Middle East do have a very different culture than we do. They don't have as many choices. I think we were all deeply disturbed and aggrieved by the horrible story of the young girl who, coming back from the market in a central Pakistan village, was raped by a bunch of village thugs who wanted to intimidate her father into selling them his plot of land. And that's what actually happened. What came through is that they were offended by something her brother had done. In fact, they were trying to intimidate her father to selling land. This happens a lot, and it happens too much, and it isn't a class thing. There's another story in Pakistan as well of a very well-to-do family, a family that would often be invited to the embassy. This was before my time, to embassy events, and their daughter married for love. She eloped. They'd found someone for her to marry, and she ran off with the young man that she loved. And her family felt that they then had a code of honor that they had to execute on, and she feared for her life. So she contacted a human rights lawyer in Lahore and was making the case, asking the lawyer under constitutional law, rule of law, to protect her. Her mother came into the office and shot her dead. No, it's true. This happens, and this happens today. This is not a culture that we're familiar with. It's something that they're going to have to work out. But again, let me say, I am encouraged. I'm encouraged in the Gulf, where 2 weeks ago, the King of Saudi Arabia made a pronouncement, again, loosening some of the restrictions on women in Saudi Arabia. He says, there is no law against women driving a car in Saudi Arabia. It's cultural. But that's a step forward. And all throughout the Gulf, you find tiny steps forward with women. We have women can run for parliament in Kuwait. Last week, on February 1st, rather, the Middle East Institute, where I'm a president, we held a full-day conference on Iran, and we invited one of the most prestigious experts from the UAE, University of UAE, to come and speak at our conference. And she did a superb job, and she was really tough-minded and analytical. Women are making strides throughout the Middle East. The most prominent, I would say, of all the personages in Qatar today is Sheikh Mimosa, the second wife of the emir, and she is revolutionizing Qatar. So step by step, in their own way, they're getting there. And trust me, if I had to bet on it, I'm going to bet on the women.
Unfortunately, thinking that we have lots of time for questions, we never do, but it's nice to hear the ambassador give us the answers and to speak this way to answer the pertinent question that we had. Thanks for sharing your fellowship with me. We're adjourned. Ding.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health,